In 2025, the world turned its eyes toward Nepal not for its breathtaking mountains, not for Mount Everest, and not for its rich cultural heritage, but for something far more powerful. A storm was rising, and it was not in the sky, but in the hearts of the country's youngest generation. Nepal's Gen Z young men and women raised in the age of smartphones, social media, and global awareness stood up against their government in a way the world had never expected. This wasn't just another protest. It wasn't just a demand for change. It became a movement that shook the very foundations of Nepal's politics, forcing leaders to resign, toppling institutions, and rewriting the nation's future. So, what exactly triggered this revolt? Why did the ban on just a few apps spark a nationwide uprising? How did the protests escalate so quickly into chaos, violence, and revolution? And most importantly, what does this movement mean for the future of Nepal, and perhaps for the entire South Asian region? Today, we dive deep into the story behind Nepal's Gen Z revolution, a story of anger, hope, destruction, and the fight for freedom in the digital age. Stay with me, because this is not just about Nepal, this is about a global generation that refuses to stay silent. On September 4, 2025, something shocking happened in Nepal. The government suddenly announced the ban of 26 social media platforms including Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, WhatsApp, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Overnight, millions of young Nepalis woke up to find that their digital lifeline had been cut. The official explanation from the government was simple. These companies had failed to register under newly introduced laws. But for the youth, this was not about paperwork. This was about their voice, their freedom, and their connection to the world. Think about it for a second. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that every app you used to talk to your friends, to share your thoughts, to organize events, and even to learn is suddenly gone. No Instagram stories, no YouTube videos, no WhatsApp messages, no way to express yourself, no way to be heard. That's exactly what happened in Nepal. For the government, it was just a policy decision. But for Gen Z, it felt like an attack on their identity. In that moment, the silence of millions of disconnected phones was the spark that lit the fire of a revolution.
The social media ban was not the beginning of Nepal's youth anger. It was only the spark, because deep down, this frustration had been building for years. Young people in Nepal have grown up in a system where opportunity feels like a distant dream. Unemployment rates remain painfully high. Thousands graduate every year, but only a handful find stable jobs. For many, hard work doesn't guarantee success. Instead, connections and family names decide the future. Corruption has become a daily reality. Politicians promise change before elections, but once in power, they repeat the same cycle, favoring relatives, rewarding loyal friends, and ignoring ordinary citizens. This nepotism has created a wall between the rulers and the ruled. And while this goes on, the cost of living keeps rising. Food, fuel, housing, everything gets more expensive, while salaries stay the same. For an entire generation, life feels like a constant struggle just to survive. So when the government took away social media, their one escape, their one platform to laugh, to share, to express their pain and creativity, it wasn't just a ban. It felt like the system was silencing them completely. And in that silence, anger grew louder. What had been frustration turned into determination. What had been private complaints turned into public protest. The youth of Nepal had already been pushed to the edge. The social media ban simply pushed them over. It didn't take long for the anger to spill out onto the streets. Just 4 days after the social media ban, on September 8th and 9th, Nepal witnessed something extraordinary. From the capital city of Kathmandu to towns across the nation, thousands of young people, students, professionals, and even teenagers poured into the streets. They marched with banners in their hands and determination in their voices. They shouted slogans for freedom, accountability, and justice. Their voices echoed through the narrow streets of Kathmandu, demanding a future that felt stolen from them. At first, the demonstrations were peaceful. Crowds gathered at city squares, chanting, waving flags, and demanding the government listen. But as hours passed, tensions grew. Frustrated groups broke past barricades and began targeting the symbols of power. The parliament building was stormed by angry protesters who saw it as the very heart of corruption. Government offices were attacked, doors smashed, and files set ablaze. The chaos spread quickly. The Supreme Court building, once a symbol of justice, was damaged in the fury. The Prime Minister's office came under attack, windows shattered, walls scarred, even government residences, homes of powerful officials, were set on fire. What began as anger over a social media ban had transformed into something much larger. This was no longer about apps or websites. This was about an entire generation rising against a broken system. For the first time in decades, Nepal's leaders realized that their own youth were no longer willing to stay silent. The protests had begun, and there was no turning back. As the protests grew louder and more widespread, the government decided to strike back. Curfews were declared across major cities. Streets that just a day earlier were filled with chanting voices now echoed with the sound of sirens and armored vehicles. Police in riot gear moved in. They fired tear gas into crowds, filling the air with smoke that made it almost impossible to breathe. They shot rubber bullets, injuring dozens who had come out unarmed, and in some areas, reports claimed that even live rounds were used, but instead of scaring the people into silence, these tactics only added fuel to the fire. Every act of violence made the protesters more determined. Nepal's youth had grown up online, and they quickly turned technology into their strongest weapon. Even with social media banned, they used VPNs, proxies, and underground apps to communicate and organize. What the government tried to silence in the streets was amplified even louder on the internet. Videos of clashes, of young people facing tear gas, of bloodied protesters refusing to back down, spread rapidly across the globe. Each clip, each image, each live stream became a symbol of resistance, and suddenly, this wasn't just a story within Nepal anymore. It was on the screens of millions worldwide. From New Delhi to New York, from London to Tokyo, the world began watching a small Himalayan nation where its youth were standing up against power. The government's harsh response had backfired. Instead of ending the protests, it had made sure that Nepal's Gen Z revolt was now a global headline. As the protests grew louder and more widespread, the government decided to strike back. Curfews were declared across major cities. Streets that just a day earlier were filled with chanting voices now echoed with the sound of sirens and armored vehicles. Police in riot gear moved in. They fired tear gas into crowds, filling the air with smoke that made it almost impossible to breathe. They shot rubber bullets, injuring dozens who had come out unarmed, and in some areas, reports claimed that even live rounds were used, but instead of scaring the people into silence, these tactics only added fuel to the fire. Every act of violence made the protesters more determined. Nepal's youth had grown up online, and they quickly turned technology into their strongest weapon. Even with social media banned, they used VPNs, proxies, and underground apps to communicate and organize. What the government tried to silence in the streets was amplified even louder on the internet. Videos of clashes, of young people facing tear gas, of bloodied protesters refusing to back down, spread rapidly across the globe. Each clip, each image, each live stream became a symbol of resistance, and suddenly, this wasn't just a story within Nepal anymore. It was on the screens of millions worldwide. From New Delhi to New York, from London to Tokyo, the world began watching a small Himalayan nation where its youth were standing up against power. The government's harsh response had backfired. Instead of ending the protests, it had made sure that Nepal's Gen Z revolt was now a global headline.
As the protests grew uncontrollable and the death toll rose, the pressure on Nepal's leadership became unbearable. Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli, once seen as a strongman of Nepali politics, now stood isolated. His government had failed to calm the anger of the youth, and had instead fueled it with violence and suppression. Finally, on September 12, 2025, the breaking point arrived. In a dramatic turn of events, Oli announced his resignation. Crowds on the streets erupted, not in celebration alone, but in relief. For many, it felt like the first real victory of the people against a government they no longer trusted. But the story didn't end there. That same day, history was made when Sushila Karki, the former Chief Justice of Nepal, was appointed as the interim Prime Minister. She became the first female leader in Nepal's history. Her task was monumental: to restore order in a nation on the brink of collapse, to bring dialogue between government and youth, and to prepare for new elections in March 2026. For a brief moment, there was hope. Hope that Nepal might rise from the ashes of chaos, under new leadership, and with the voice of its youth finally being heard.
Out on the streets, through chants, placards, and online messages, the youth of Nepal made their vision crystal clear. This wasn't just anger, it was a list of demands for a better future. First, digital freedom. They wanted every banned social media platform restored. For them, the internet wasn't entertainment, it was their voice, their connection to the world. Second, accountability. They were done with the endless cycle of corruption and nepotism. No more leaders handing power to family and friends. They wanted transparency, justice, and leaders who answered to the people. Third, opportunities. Nepal's Gen Z wanted jobs, education, and real chances to build a future inside their own country, not just a ticket to migrate abroad. And finally, justice. For every life lost and every protester injured, they demanded fair investigations and accountability from those in power. For the first time in Nepal's history, the youngest generation wasn't just protesting. They were shaping the political future of their nation, loud, fearless, and unstoppable.
Ironically, the very thing the government tried to silence became the youth's loudest weapon. Even though Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X were banned, Nepal's Gen Z refused to be cut off. They quickly turned to VPNs, proxies, and underground apps to log back in. From the streets of Kathmandu, videos of clashes, speeches, and songs of resistance were uploaded within minutes. These clips went viral, reaching millions around the world. Soon, hashtags like #Uprising and #Gen-Z began trending globally. News agencies, activists, and influencers picked them up, making sure Nepal's struggle was seen far beyond its borders. And here's the twist. The government's attempt to silence the youth actually backfired. Instead of isolating the protests, the ban only amplified them, turning a national movement into an international story. For a generation raised online, social media wasn't just a tool. It was their voice, their weapon, and their shield. And in this battle, it proved stronger than the government's restrictions.
To understand why the Gen Z revolt shook Nepal so deeply, we need to look at the system itself. For decades, Nepal's politics has been marked by instability. Governments rise and fall so often that no leader stays long enough to bring real change. Corruption scandals have become routine. From parliament to local offices, stories of bribes, favoritism, and misuse of power dominate the headlines. And because of this, public trust has collapsed. Courts are seen as politicized. Police are accused of serving the powerful instead of the people. Even parliament, the symbol of democracy, is viewed as weak and disconnected. The Gen Z revolt ripped away the last layer of illusion. It showed the world just how fragile Nepal's institutions had become. When young people marched in the streets, they weren't just angry at one prime minister or one policy. They were challenging an entire system of rot that had failed them for years. For many, this uprising wasn't just about social media or even jobs. It was about demanding a government that finally worked for the people, not against them.
As the protests in Nepal grew, the world could no longer stay silent. The United Nations issued a strong statement, urging Nepal's leaders to respect human rights and allow peaceful protests. They warned that excessive force against civilians could push the country into deeper crisis. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch demanded immediate investigations into the killings and injuries. They called for justice for the families who had lost their loved ones in the violence. Meanwhile, India, Nepal's closest neighbor, expressed deep concern. On one hand, India urged stability, worried about chaos spilling across the border. But on the other hand, many Indian youth on social media openly supported Nepal's Gen Z, seeing it as an inspiring fight against corruption and repression. Across the world, headlines described Nepal as a nation at a turning point, where a young generation was rewriting the country's political story under the eyes of the international community.
Nepal's Gen Z revolt is not just another protest. It is a wake-up call from a generation that refuses to live in silence. They stood up for digital freedom, the right to speak, connect, and be heard. They demanded honest governance and end to corruption and nepotism. And above all, they demanded a chance to live with dignity in their own country, without being forced to leave in search of opportunities abroad. The road ahead will not be easy. Nepal's politics is fragile, its institutions weak, and its future uncertain. But one thing is undeniable: the youth have already changed the national conversation. They have forced leaders, citizens, and even the world to recognize that this generation is different, louder, stronger, and unwilling to compromise on their rights. If the government and international community listen, Nepal may see real reforms in democracy, in justice, in opportunity. But if those in power ignore this message, another wave of unrest will almost certainly follow, and it may be even stronger than the first. This is not just about Nepal. It is a story of every young generation that refuses to be silenced. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay engaged, and share this story, because it is one the world cannot afford to ignore.